Okay, in the very last lecture of this module, we're going to be discussing social change and social movements. We definitely know that society is not in any way static. It is constantly changing, so we're going to take a look at least briefly in some of the ways in which that change takes place. When we talk about social change, we just talk about a shift in the characteristics of a society. So again, societies don't stay the same, that then the changes that go on in society affect individuals' lives, and in turn then individuals then behave differently and can then influence change in the societal structure. When we look at just some historical examples of social change, we've already discussed those when we talked about societal transformation, in the ways that human beings change behavior sometimes by inventing new technologies. So we definitely talked about the movement, the invention or the learning how to domesticate animals, change societies from hunter-gatherer to pastoral horticultural societies, or the invention of the plow transformed society into agricultural societies. Certainly the Industrial Revolution was an enormous social change. We saw not just a change in the way we do things, but in a lot of ways, the ways that human beings interacted. And then in a more modern sense, we can clearly say that the transformation from an industrial society to an information society was caused by what we might consider to be an information revolution, an explosion of information in our society, which has clearly resulted in society being very different even today than it was 50 years ago. Speaking specifically of the Industrial Revolution, we sometimes talk about a very important social change, which is sometimes referred to as modernization. And again, as we move farther down the line away from the Industrial Revolution, that term itself may take on some different meanings. But clearly for people like Marx and Weber, this idea of modernization came about because of the Industrial Revolution and the dramatic changes it brought to society, which changed the very characteristics or nature of society as a whole. So when we talk about how does social change come about, there's a couple of different theories, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but a couple different ways of looking at how social change comes about. We can certainly look at the idea that cultures or societies evolve over time, what we call cultural evolution. And this is just basically the idea that societies generally start off in a primitive form and then advance and become more and more complex as they go along. We've discussed that kind of throughout the entire course. However, when we just break it down to cultural evolution, there's a implied sense of some societies which do evidence this progress are then in some ways considered maybe perhaps, again, in a biased way, more superior than those societies that do not experience a lot of social change. And for that reason, this idea of cultural evolution is largely kind of discredited today, because just because a society changes, we don't necessarily, again, the idea of evolution implies evolution toward a better or higher state. Whereas we might say today, it's kind of unfair to say, okay, just because a society transformed, it didn't necessarily get better. Or conversely, that societies that don't exhibit a lot of change are somehow worse off. So the idea of cultural evolution, largely kind of discredited, not really in vogue. We could talk about the idea that societies follow a natural cycle. So instead of a linear path, they might take more of a circular path, where we definitely see societies rise. Okay, so kind of the ascension of a society, or societies come into being, they mature over time, and then start to experience some type of decline. And then that maybe sets up the stage for either that society to continue to not exist or transform into another type of society, which may then rise and mature and then decline, and then kind of the idea the wheel keeps turning. So again, sometimes and you'll hear the argument is about the United States. Is the United States a society in decline? Perhaps, we've experienced a foundation and certainly a maturity or a rise, and then argument will sometimes go, we seem to be a society in decline, or we can take a look at historical examples, again, say Rome, and look at how it came up, as a city-state or as a society. The Roman Empire developed from an earlier state into a very powerful state, and then eventually, of course, declined and then transformed into something else, or something else took its place. So again, the natural cycle theory is exactly that, looking at it as a circular thing. Marx would definitely look at a conflict over power type of theory or model of how societies change, in that there's always what we sometimes call the status quo, or the way things are, and then there are people within the society that want to change, usually because they feel that that society is somehow being unfair. So we might talk about capitalism as being the status quo, and again, in a Marxist version, and then those people that are being exploited by capitalism would feel that things need to change, and whether or not that happens through, like I said, struggles over power, some type of revolution, but eventually that some type of synthesis or a compromise will come out of this conflict, resulting in a new type of society. And if it does not, then the process just kind of repeats itself until that synthesis exists. So Marx would clearly say in this conflict that people, while certainly capitalism exists and there is exploitation of people within that system, that those people will continue to resist, and if the exploitation gets to be too great, they will ultimately resist in a violent manner, and that will either change the society to some degree where everybody, again in a Marxist viewpoint, will establish a more equal society, or that the conflict will continue to go on until those issues are resolved. And then a social theorist by the name of William Ogburn, who in the early 20th century, the 1920s, definitely talked about the idea of kind of a three-stage way that social change happens. He talked about invention, the idea of there are new elements introduced into a society, whether or not they're introduced from within or they're brought into the society. Again, kind of like we were talking about, maybe the invention of the plow, or the learning to domesticate animals, or other kinds of social changes that happen in society, and that leads to discovery. In other words, a new view of the world. So people will, the society as a whole will now change the way it thinks about things because of this process of discovery. So once again, we might even think about, I think in an earlier module, I definitely talked about the idea of the printing press. So we invent the printing press, and that leads us to our road of discovery, because now knowledge is more widely available, and it's easier to produce books and share information, and that leads to a new vision of the world, and we generally talk about that as the Renaissance or the Enlightenment, this discovery of new types of thinking, and then diffusion, where then that information is going to be spread all around within the society and even beyond the societal boundaries, so that spread to other areas of the world, perhaps. So once again, we talk about the Renaissance, which originated in one specific area because of one specific invention, but changed the way people think, and then those attitudes spread all around the world. So you could also think about, let's say, the modern invention of the internet, or the microchip, which led to certainly development of personal computers, personal computing, led to clearly differences in thought about how the world should work and our vision of the world and how we share information, and then diffusion, the idea that those ideas about how society should be then spread around the world and create, again, social change. So there's many different ways of thinking about how social change comes about. When we talk about, again, social change, we often discuss then the idea of social movements. So these are large numbers of people, generally I'm talking about within a society, who organize in order to, and again, I put down here, promote or resist social change. Not all social change is necessarily regarded as good or positive by all the members of society. So sometimes social movements actually exist to resist or try to keep things from changing. A good example of this, if we talk about a very important social movement in the United States, we talk about the civil rights movement, we could certainly say that, again, a large number of people definitely promoted social change and moving America away from a segregate society, or a society that practiced segregation, to a more equal society. But for as many people who wanted to promote that, there were organizations that also chose to resist that. An example of that might be the Ku Klux Klan. So that would be a social movement to resist social change and want to keep things the way they are in society. Social movements, there's many different types that you could think about. Certainly they can either target individual types of behaviors in society, or involve just changing things for some individuals in society, or they can seek to change society as a whole. So maybe, like I said, specific behaviors. Certainly in our society, in American society, we've had social movements, again, before Prohibition in the 1920s. We could say that the temperance movement, or the idea of trying to get people to stop drinking, would be an example of a social movement. But again, it wasn't trying to change society as a whole, but instead to try to target a certain behavior. Whereas when we might talk about things on a larger scale, especially a society, let's say, that shares a very similar religion with the majority of people, and we see a religious movement that would seek to try to change society as a whole. So broad changes in a state religion might be something that would convert the entire society. Sometimes we can actually talk about attempts to just try to, like I said, change specific rules in society. We could talk about the animal rights movement as an attempt to try to reform society. And then we could talk about the social movement toward a better society as a whole as being more of a transformation rather than a reformation. So there's definitely different types of social movements, and they target different aspects of society. But for the most part, we can talk about social movements occurring in specific stages. One, certainly, that it starts with an unrest or an agitation in society. If everybody's happy, then there's not likely to be a social movement. Typically, we talk about the idea that people are upset and want to change a specific type of, or an element of society. So there has to be some kind of unrest, and there has to be a specific problem or something about society that people want to change. And then this is typically when we see leaders then start to arise. And in many cases, when we talked about authority earlier in an earlier module, we talked about different types of leaderships or authority, and one of the things we talked about was charismatic leaders. So this would be a prime time probably for a charismatic leader to step up and produce a message, or to rally people around the idea that there's an injustice or something that needs to be changed about society. Then we talked about mobilization, and in that we're talking basically about mobilizing resources. So once people have identified a problem, we have to determine what can we do about it, and in that it's a mobilization of maybe things like people, just in the sense of trying to get people on board, spreading information, gathering information. It might be a gathering of money or other type of material resources. Certainly an investment of time, getting people to get on board and donate or volunteer their time or effort into something. So again, the movement's going to start with unrest, and then they're going to start to mobilize their resources. And then generally the next stage is organization. So there has to be some policies established. What do we actually want? How do we want to go about accomplishing it? How are we going to use the resources that have been mobilized? And often then kind of more formalized leadership. So who is going to be the face or the voice of our organization? That it can be one person or groups of people, but we definitely then get to a point of some type of formalized leadership. And then usually somewhere down the line, and again, there's no definite place in here for where the actual social change takes place. It may take place at any point along here, but it's usually sometimes after organization. But then there's a process of institutionalization. Typically social movements take on, then I guess they get larger, especially if they become successful, they take on kind of a formal hierarchy, or as we discussed in an earlier module, bureaucracy sets in. So they become much larger, start to follow those characteristics of bureaucracy as far as organization. Then sometimes we actually do see leadership becoming focused in a very small way. So within an organization, sometimes referred to as oligarchy, ruled by a small group. A common criticism here is that social movements, as they become more institutionalized, then the leaders become more interested in maintaining their own positions, especially of power or control over resources, than perhaps what the social movement set out to do in the first place. And then this can definitely lead to, but it's not necessarily inevitable, a decline then in the social movements, kind of where the movement becomes more interested in the actual bureaucracy, the running of the bureaucracy, or these day-to-day concerns, rather than the original intent for which it started out. Sometimes this is marked by kind of a loss of focus or a loss of committed followers. So the fan base, as it were, might tend to kind of slough off or stop following. And this certainly can set up for a possible resurgence, that idea of, okay, we've got to get back on track, or what were we doing in the first place? Why did we set out to do this? Ideas within the social movement. So again, decline is not necessarily inevitable, but there's certainly been a lot of situations in which these stages have been played out. So once again, we talk about a historical example. Certainly in the United States, there's a significant number of people during Jim Crow period, or the period between the abolishment of slavery, but before the Civil Rights Movement. Certainly a large number of people who certainly felt a lot of agitation or unrest about racial segregation and prejudice and discrimination. Certainly we could say that some very important leaders stepped into this. Of course, probably the most famous being the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, a very charismatic leader. Again, the mobilization of resources and some of the earlier things like bus boycotts and attempts to mount resistance efforts. Certainly organization comes about when we start to see the movement spread and become nationalized. So while it started in certain areas, certain cities in the South, Mobile, Alabama, Montgomery, those kind of places, it certainly then spread and became much more organized, up to and including perhaps the foundation of the NAACP, which clearly became an institution in its time, and certainly following the loss of the charismatic leader, Martin Luther King, became much more reliant on a bureaucratic institution. And again, scholars who have studied the social movement of the civil rights movement can certainly point to the idea that in very many ways it was very successful, and in other ways it could actually point to, in some ways, that that movement has since declined and maybe taken on a different form. Will there be a resurgence? Perhaps.